I'm John Atack. This is my guest, who is
Mark Laxer.
Yeah, who has recently published a fantastic graphic novel, free of charge, which everybody should rush out and look at, called Rama Trauma Trump, in one James Joycean word. And you also have a book out before about riding across America with a dog.
Yeah.
On a bike.
Yeah. So Rama Trauma Trump, I left the cult and now look what happened.
Yeah.
It's my third book. And the first book is the book that this third one is based upon. So the bicycle trip is called Take Me for a Ride, Coming of Age in a Destructive Cult. Both these books I'm referring to are nonfiction. So the first book is not a graphic novel. It's about my experiences getting myself in and out of the inner circle of a group that seemed benign and over many years became quite abusive. And when I get out of the group, I do some thinking. And the way I sort of reflect on all those years, a la Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance, where there's really sort of two narratives, two threads that kind of intertwine, is I go on a bicycle trip across the United States.
Was that because you couldn't afford a motorbike, or?
Well, actually, the bicycle is actually part of my story. However, I probably could not have afforded a motorbike. Yeah, so that's quite correct.
I am myself a cyclist and have been since I was 5 years old, and I've never had a motorbike.
I think that's brilliant. So I'm not quite sure, because we've only just met, but for me, John, the bicycle is a very powerful symbol of self-reliance. I don't need, like a motorbike, I don't need petrol. I don't need a lot of maintenance that I can't do myself. So when I was, actually for me, it was a bit older than 5 years old, but I did very much when I was younger get into bicycling. And I just found that it was very self-empowering. And I could get up those mountains or hills, or in rainy weather or whatnot, on my own. And it gave me quite a bit of self-confidence. And then I joined this group that got really quite abusive. And I think you, and you know, a number of other people have been through experiences similar, or, you know, someone gets an abusive marriage, I guess, or the president of the country goes crazy. It's rather...
Not naming any names.
No. I'm just saying hypothetically.
Hypothetical elected president.
Yes, everything is fine here in America. Don't you worry. So when I left this group, after being in it for about 7 years, and what for me became sort of involvement in the inner circle, so I sort of helped found this group, I went back to the bicycle. And it became a very potent symbol for me. So I think the way some of these cults work is using fear and sort of chipping away, maybe not right away, but gradually over years, chipping away at one's self-confidence. Yeah. So when I left the group, which for me was not easy at all, I went back to the bicycle and bicycled everywhere. I lived in Boston at the time. This was in 1985. And as you well know, Boston gets quite chilly in the winter. And I bicycled, I believe it was 22 miles each day, every weekday, Monday through Friday, no matter the weather. And it just gave me a sense of strength. I remember my boss, he bet me $10 I couldn't do it. And he later came to my desk and said, "All right, Laxer." And he wrote me
$10. Don't do it again.
Yeah, $10. So what happened, John, was then the bicycle trip, which is described in my first book, Take Me for a Ride. The bicycle trip was me getting back on my feet and thinking about how could I have gotten in a destructive cult. I you know, at age 17, I was doing very well. I had lots of friends. I gave the speech at graduation at my high school, and I was editor of I had a great life going. And I was a seeker. It wasn't like I was lacking. I don't feel like I was down and out and desperate.
No.
I was looking for something greater than what the New York Times, which is a wonderful newspaper, but what they were describing the world of reason and logic and how electronics work and gravity and physics and all this wonderful common sense stuff. So I did very well with all that. I was looking for something in addition to that.
The metaphysics.
Just something bigger. What's behind it all? What does it all mean?
My own journey was the same. Some people call us seekers. Other people call us idealists. We're not people who were miserable, pathetic people who got dragged into a terrible, destructive group. We're people who wanted to make the world a better place and wanted to understand our place within that world. And we were lured in your case, by a man who splashed a lot of LSD around and shouted at people, and in my case, by a total lunatic who I had the good fortune never to meet. But my own experience was actually very easy because I was never a living member. I wasn't forced to take LSD. Nobody. Well, there were 2 occasions when somebody shouted at me, and I shouted back at them, but because I didn't realise I wasn't meant to. So, you sort of, for me, when I left, what I used to, rebuild my identity, my ego, whatever we're going to call it, was the Lao Tzu's Tao Te Ching, and I spent several months while helping people who've been affected by Scientology. Making my own really awful version of the Tao Te Ching. But it somehow pulled my head completely out of Scientology. And I realized, hey, this guy has reconstructed my mind and I don't have to pay any attention to him. I can make all of my own decisions. And it was incredibly liberating for me. Now, having dealt with about 600 people in the recovery, it is not incredibly liberating for most people. So what they need to do is to get a bike and a dog as well. Is that necessary?
I would suggest a puppy.
A puppy and ride across America.
Right. Now, most sensible
and read
people,
Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance, of course.
Of course. I would say most people, when they bicycle across the United States, they go west to east because that's where the headwinds take one.
Oh, Ken Kesey went west to east, didn't he? So
Ken Kesey certainly went west to east, and he one flew east, one flew west.
One flew over the cuckoo's
nest. The cuckoo's nest, yes, indeed. So what I write in my first book, fly east, fly west, but don't fly into the cuckoo's nest, or conversely, fly me over the cuckoo's nest to your gold inside. I don't care if you're the cuckoo, take me for a ride.
Fair enough.
So, yeah, absolutely. So I had a bit of an adventure with Ken Kesey. Is that right to share?
Go ahead. Yeah, we'd love to hear that. I love Ken Kesey's work.
It's a bit of a virtual journey. In the time of COVID, everything's so distant.
We live in a virtual world now, in the Matrix now.
It certainly is. So I found that reading One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest by Ken Kesey was fascinating. I found that reading Tom Wolfe's The Electric Kool-Aid Acid Test, which is this wonderful book, I see that you've had the joy of reading it as well, about, in a sense, at least one strand of it, how the hippie movement got started. So it's sort of about culture. And I found that by reading these books and many other books, including Lao Tzu, when I left this group, I was able to put my experiences inside some type of cultural context. The word cult, of course, sort of neatly fits into the word culture.
And they both go to the word cultus.
Absolutely. And both are very complicated. Cults are not simple, nor is culture. And so I found it fascinating to study the culture I was in, the hippie movement and sort of this new age movement. I was able to sort of, in a sense, map, almost in a 3D, I'm being metaphorical here, in a 3D kind of way where my cult experiences fit and how the New Age movement came about and how that fit in with the hippies and such. Back to my story.
So, let me just say, before we get back to your story, that was very important to me too, because although I was 12 when the Summer of Love happened, I identified myself as a long-haired person in a culture of short-haired people. In fact, when I was at school at 15, I was in a school of 1,100 kids, and I didn't realize until 2 years later I was the only boy with long hair. And when the teachers, because I'd moved schools from a very authoritarian, snobby school down to the lowest of the low sorts of schools, which was much more.
Yes.
That I didn't realize that when the teachers there said, "Would you get your hair cut?" because they were very nice, that because that wasn't saying, "You horrible trollop, get your hair cut," which was what I was used to at the snobby school, I ignored them. So I was at the Isle of Wight Festival and saw Miles Davis and the Who and Jimi Hendrix in Chicago
and Fairport Convention,
all of that stuff, and so it was very important to me, and I burrowed into the origins of the hippie movement through Nature Boy, the famous German who's one of the founders. This idea that the Nazis and the hippies have a common origin in the folk movement in Germany. That was quite funky. I read Jack Kerouac, and I was actually in touch with William Burroughs because he was involved in Scientology. So he used to have a friend of his ring me up and see what was happening. What a horrible man. But, that whole, how the beatniks sort of transformed, and then of course Neil Cassidy ends up driving both Jack Kerouac and
throwing
the bus.
The hammer, and yes, of course, he was the conduit between the two generations.
And then of course the famous death of hippie, what in February '67, when Kesey says it's all done now, and the media pick it up, and it becomes this movement, which in the US was very much involved with the protest against the incredibly stupid Vietnam War. Yeah. Whereas in the UK, we didn't know. We didn't have conscription, so we didn't know that we were fighting a massive war in Malaysia at the same time. So we were not influenced in the same way. And I've written novels that try and explore this. I wrote a novel called Halcyon Days, which is set in 1966, trying to sort of look at how the psychedelic movement that brought us Pink Floyd and prog rock and all of this differed so much from that kind of Grateful Dead, Jefferson Airplane culture. So we're on similar pages here. Let's say that
similar pages, not exactly the same, but very, very similar. And I guess in terms of our discussion about cults, I would say, and how that relates to the nascent hippie movement. I would say this. Of course, I'm not a sociologist. I'm just an armchair reader and observer of the world around me. I would say that in the 50s, I'm talking about in the United States, things were a bit structured and rigid. And without getting too judgmental, I think I'll just say the word boring. It's just sort of very straight-laced, and conformity might be a good adjective for that time.
And if I can put in there that a lot of the social psychology experiments that we've learned from, Milgram, Sharif in the 50s, up to Zimbardo's experiments in 71, the Stanford prison experiment, were in a culture that is actually far more conformist than our own. When these experiments are now repeated, say the Solomon Asch experiment, where you have lines of different lengths, but everyone in the room agrees they're the same length. There was a replication with 396 people. So 396, only one of them agreed that the lines were the same length. So time has changed, and I think that conformity and the idea of the normal, that people wanted to be normal, whatever that was.
It's shifted. I'm with you there, John. Absolutely, and thanks for bringing that up. And I guess my point is that the 60s, in a sense, Jefferson Airplane and the protests and the burnings and whatnot.
The days of rain.
and the smashing of the guitars. It was really a kind of reaction to the boring, staid conformity, and bringing up feminism and equal rights and rights of blacks and Hispanics and all sorts of things. I personally am for all these things, the feminism and the creativity and breaking out of the conformity. However, and this is a big however, because I would say, again, this is an armchair sociologist speaking here. I would say that when you dismantle a structure as naughty or as unhelpful or as slightly or very abusive, though that structure may be, John, what happens is there's this vacuum.
Yeah, of course.
There's a lack of structure, and there's a sense of, okay, folks, who's in charge? What do we do now? And I was growing up. I was coming of age. For my first book, the subtitle is Coming of Age in a Destructive Cult. Another subtitle could have been Coming of Age in a Society that was vastly confused and no one knew which way was up.
Yeah.
And again, I'm not criticizing. I'm glad the 60s and the sexual revolution and all that stuff happened. I am a child of that, and the people around me don't have any rules of engagement, just in terms of the genders. It's like, okay, so the man's not in charge. Well, who the hell is in charge? Okay, the Pope and the priests are not looked up to. Well, who do we look up to? We look up to Rama, Frederick Lenz, or the guy Hubbard, or whomever in Scientology. And the people who took the place of the existing, not perfect, not even near perfect structures, a lot of them were at least as corrupt as what they replaced. And that's very much my story.
I think the mistake is that we went from one set of authoritarians to another. I mean, do you know Slogans and Mantras, Stephen Kent's book?
Which is that one I don't know.
Well, he's a sociologist, and he probably does have an armchair too, but writing specifically about the influence of the hippie movement upon cults. He is one of the world's leading sociologists from my perception, and I know him, so I'm hoping that he'll be watching this and going, oh, God, John's saying that I'm one of the leading sociologists. He's written quite a lot about Scientology. But I absolutely recommend that book. I don't agree with it. I think that I do agree with it, but there's some of the elements that led to cults, but there are other elements. And I think you're talking about a significant element, which is that society was changing, that the tendency for human societies is to be authoritarian. That is to say that there'll be people who think they should be the bosses, and there are people who think that those people should be the bosses. And I think that this adds up actually to the number that Milgram found, somewhere around 60% of people. Schopenhauer, and I'm not a big expert on Schopenhauer, he reckoned about 60% of people in the 1850s, they cannot think. So they seek direction, they become dependent. Exactly. And the thing is really to teach, I think, two things. The first is how to recognize predatory human beings and not follow them, and not be prey. You know, there are some models that, I mean, Donald Trump, for example, has said there are predators and prey, and that's all there is. I believe that there are non-predators and non-prey. There are people who actually grow up and become adult, get past the age of 17 or 18, and, you know, they're not consumers. They're not people who are driven to have a car that's faster than their neighbors or what have you. They're not driven by possession. They grow up. And that if there's any mission that I have in life, it's to get people to work it out for themselves. But you first of all have to get them to the point where they can work it out for themselves. So
listen, I don't mean to interrupt, but I'm so much with you. And I so much believe in what you say that I've got a project where I'm only charging $10,000 a month. And if I'm joking, I'm sorry.
Sign me up.
Yeah.
You'll have to lend me the money.
I very much agree with you. I'm sorry to be silly, because
No, you can be as silly as you like. I'm a very silly person myself. I think the thing is that you and I both, one thing that we've agreed on, and I'm told that for ladies this is a bad idea, that we give it away for free. That I've never, for every person that has ever paid me money to help them, there are 99 people who didn't. It got to the point where somebody had to pay the bills, and the choice was I could go and stack the shelves at the supermarket and have 10 minutes a week free to help people, or I could do this. But I do feel that, a missionary zeal, of course, to put out certain ideas into the culture, because I think the culture has gone wrong. I mean, I'm very passionate about the work of Erich Fromm, who I think, although he sold millions of books, he wasn't really listened to. And so at the moment, if you go to the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of the American Psychiatric Association number 5, it has in it a thing called the narcissistic personality disorder. This personality disorder was utterly and totally defined by Erich Fromm. It comes from a book called The Heart of Man, which was published in 1964. He was the first person to use the term malignant narcissist, which is what that describes. But what people forget about is that therefore affirms there are benign narcissists. And by his definition, a benign narcissist is somebody who has not created a self. And so therefore, in our culture, about 2/3 of people, by his definition, are benign narcissists. They don't do things because they want to. Joseph Campbell tells a story about sitting in a diner and some kid says, "I don't want to drink my orange juice." And his dad says, "I haven't done a thing in my life I wanted to do. Drink your orange juice." And it's about not drinking in fact, it was Flavor-Aid at Jonestown. What a PR coup that was, blaming it on Kool-Aid. And people still say it, don't they? But it's getting people to the point where they can have their own tastes, their own preferences, make their own decisions, and leave me alone and stop asking for my advice. That's where I'm headed. I want to leave the building.
Yes, well, that certainly makes sense, and I feel that I think I'm motivated by a very similar feeling within myself, and that is that my experiences in a quote unquote spiritual or semi-religious group or New Age cult very much translates in my mind to me observing the political situation. And I look at our democracy in the United States and I just see how fragile it is.
Well, as Leonard Cohen said, democracy is coming to the USA.
Good for Leonard. Yeah, he's quite amazing. So I just feel that bad things happen when good people do nothing. And I've read more than my fair share about the Spanish Civil War and Franco and Germany in the late 30s and early 40s. I'm currently reading this amazing memoir by a German Jew named Victor Klemperer, who is living in Dresden.
I've heard of it.
And I can't help but see the parallels with, not just the United States, what's happening in a number of countries that are turning authoritative. I've also, with my second book, studied quite a bit about biology and sociobiology and E.O. Wilson and that sort of thing.
I will have to actually stop you at this point because I think that is outdated. And the evolutionary development people, like Eva Jablonka, have pushed aside the Mendelian, E.O. Wilson, Dawkins model and shown that there's something far more wonderful happening, that genes are not read-only, they can be written upon, as epigenetics shows us.
Yes,
and
epigenetics is
culture too can change things. I think there's a paradigm shift occurring in the last 20 years there.
Yes, there's certainly...
And you can look on our channel to actually find Yuval Noah, who's one of the pioneers in this field, talking about what this means culturally and how people become involved with cults because of what's being called Evo Devo. Which always makes me think about the band. Are we not men? Evo Devo.
Cones on their heads. And, yeah.
So, sorry about that. I've been rude to you about EO.
Oh, no, that's fine. I think that's fascinating. I guess my point about bringing up biology is that it seems to be a problem with our species, and I apologize for our species, but I also
So you should, frankly.
Yeah, but I also feel a lot of hope, and it's
me too.
Like you, I do a lot of things for free just because I feel that that's my responsibility as a citizen.
Yes.
Whether that's a U.S. citizen or a world citizen or however.
As Charlie Chaplin said when asked, "I'm a patriot of the world."
Yes,
you know?
yes.
And we must be, because this whole idea of nationalism is all authoritarian. You know, when you were talking before, I was saying we made the mistake of not reading Bakunin and understanding that we didn't have to be subject. And we now have the idea of the scale-free network. We don't have to have God, the king, and us. You know, how do you know he's the king? He's not covered in shit, as Monty Python pointed out. That this whole pyramid, Evo Devo, this whole pyramid idea it's not good for us. It happened in Sumeria. It was good for them and fine. But now there are too many of us, and we have to learn how to be scale-free nodes working within a system.
Yes. It's this steep hierarchy bit. It's just a bit too much. I mean, it might be good for a year or two as if you get caught in a cult, but then it's good to get out of that cult and then sort of flatten the hierarchy a bit. Now they're talking about flattening the curve.
Which is democracy, which is where everybody has a voice. And John Stuart Mill in On Liberty in the 1850s pointed out how to do this, and he's been ignored ever since, you know.
Yeah. So I had the rare opportunity to be in a room with a charismatic, destructive cult leader whilst he was tripping on acid. And I write about this not only in my first book, but in my third book. It's the same story. It's just
you know, I've said this at the beginning, but I really, you know, as soon as it arrived, and I'm really busy, I'm actually editing the fourth and hopefully final edition of my book, Opening Minds. But I stopped and read your book all the way through. It's only 34 pages. It's very straightforward. Beautiful illustrations.
Thank you so much. Yes, Marcy did a fabulous job with the illustration. It was actually a complete joy to work with her and to collaborate, to create these metaphors and things like that. But you know, when we were talking before, John, about this steep hierarchy, which I'm sure on some deep level I gravitate toward just because I'm a social, biological human, hominid primate, and I apologize for that. But that's where I am, and I'm working on it, trying to work on it. But it was fascinating for me when Frederick Lenz, Fred, Rama, Atmamanda, whatever name you want to use, with thousands of followers over the years, Newsweek called him the yuppie guru and so on and so forth. He called me into the room in a place in the Anza Borrego Desert. He was tripping his brains back. He was actually having a bad acid trip. Of course, what is one of the characteristics of a destructive cult leader? They don't particularly make themselves vulnerable. They have such a steep hierarchy. They can't just be friends and say, "Oh, I've had a bad day. I'm depressed." Or, you know, friends do that.
Yeah.
He couldn't do that.
Humans.
But he was having a bad acid trip. And his psyche for those few hours was wide open. And he invited me into the room to help him. And the thing is, he had abused me. He's done this to me. He's done all sorts of things, but I still cared for him. So I said to him, I said, "Rama," I knew he liked birds, right? He really genuinely liked birds. I said, "Rama, you see the beautiful blue bird?" And he's like looking around, looking, where's the bird? And after a while in his imagination, he saw this beautiful blue bird and he was so happy. And here's the thing.
The blue bird of happiness.
Yes, blue bird of happiness. And the thing is, most of his followers never got to have, they didn't have this experience. They were off in the audience and they'd see him every month from 200-300 feet away. And here I am in the room with him. He's having a bad acid trip. He says, "Agni," that was the name he gave me. Agni, please come in. So I sat with him because he asked me to, and because I love the guy. We're friends. And he said to me, this to me was so educational about hierarchy and steep hierarchies and what is a cult and what is friendship. And of course, my third book, Rama Trauma Trump, is really about friendship. Yeah. It's more about friendship than it is about cults in my mind. Anyway, so Rama said to me, he started crying. He looked at me and he said, this is after he saw the pretty blue birds. He said, Agni, we used to be friends. Didn't we used to be friends? And I'm crying at this point. And I said, yes, we used to be friends. And he said, what happened? And the thing is, he wasn't BSing me, John. He was sincere. It was so beautiful and sad. It was something out of like The Once and Future King, the one book that really makes me cry. Why does it make me cry? Because it's so beautiful and poignant. And here was this guy who rose to power and hurt people, and he had a moment of calm from all the forces of his whatever abusive childhood, whatever the hell happened to him. And he tried to reach out to me in a peer-to-peer way for about 15 minutes.
Yeah.
And then and we're crying. And he said to me, John, tears in his eyes, he said, would you like to be my friend? It wasn't an act. And I said, yes. And then he fell asleep. He woke up and I stayed there to make sure he's okay because I cared about him. And then he woke up and he's coming down from his acid trip. Again, I'm not a psychiatrist. I'm not a psychologist, but I have a little bit of experience. I didn't ride the bus with Kesey, but it's as if I rode the bus with Kesey and went around the block a few times.
It certainly felt like it at the time.
It certainly felt like it. And of course I met Kesey. I haven't gotten to that story yet. So, and I met Zimbardo as well. But anyway, that's another story. So he woke up. And all of a sudden I could see this. This is like the education of Mark. Duh. That peer-to-peer thing dissipated. And he looked at me and he said, what are you doing in here? And I said, well, you asked me, to come in and stuff like that. He said to me, John, he said, are you on the net? And I said, the what? He said, are you on the net? The network, the psychic energy network. And I didn't know what the hell he's talking about. And I said, yes. And he said, oh, okay. And he said, and he started making phone calls to other people. Are you on the net? Are you on the net? And and then he fell asleep again. And then he got increasingly more abusive. My point is that here is a window into a narcissistic, I wouldn't say benign, maybe
malignant. Yeah.
Malignant, thank you. A window into a malignant narcissistic personality, and he's coming down off his acid trip and he's reforming. For those people who have experienced LSD, they have some sense of what I'm talking about. Reforming his personality, and it is, I'm talking Mount Everest or K2 or Ketchijunga steep hierarchy.
Yep.
And that moment where he had, anyway, it comes back to what is a cult? Well, a cult is where it's a really steep hierarchy that's so steep that it's a slippery slope and it's really hard to grasp onto anything. And you, as an adherent, someone who's in that environment, are very much at risk.
Yeah, I I was watching a thing about Napoleon the other day, and I didn't realize he had have you heard of the Red Genie? Yeah, Napoleon was mad. He basically received instructions from a red genie, and he wrote about it. There's no doubt about it. And you see this guy, and he hijacks the revolution, which was originally tried to bring the people without trousers, the sans-culotte, together against this bizarre system that, under the various kings, Louis XIV, 15, 16, these dreadful inequalities. They've done something, and suddenly you've got the Girondins, the Jacobins, these factions fighting each other, and instead of creating any kind of democracy, they create the directoire, the directory, and then Napoleon is able to rise up and become l'empereur and put his brothers in as kings over other countries. And, Beethoven gets pissed off with him, and the Eroica is no longer about Napoleon. That this transformation happens, that we are promised freedom, liberty, equality, fraternity. And what we get is bullshit. What we get is meet the new boss, same as the old boss, as Pete Townsend put it.
As Pete Townsend put it.
And it's finding some different way of looking at the world that actually is based upon humanitarianism, is based upon pro-social behavior, rather than upon creating a world of hatred and dictatorial control. The word cult's very interesting. It's fascinated me for a long time that a number of sociologists, as you know, have starting with Brian Wilson, have put forward, not the Beach Boy, have put forward the idea that it's wrong to use this word cult, that we should use the term new religious movement, which is an absolute nonsense, because they include new. Well, we start with that, and one of the Encyclopedia Britannica says since Joseph Smith in 1830, the founder of the Latter-day Saints or Mormons. That's new. So it's anything in the last 190 years is new. Well, that doesn't work for me. If you look to the sociologist Eileen Barker, who has put forward the idea of new religious movements, bless her, she says it's post-Second World War. That's new. Well, it might be if you're Eileen Barker. To me, new is something that happened recently. You then move to the word religious, and they include such groups as Earhart Seminar Training, the Forum, Landmark Trust, what have you, large group awareness trainings, Life Spring's another one, that have no religious pretensions, and they're now religions. The Sullivanians, the therapy movement, all sorts of groups, they're new religious movements. By the criteria that Brian Wilson laid out, which none of these sociologists seem to actually be paying attention to, so I think we can all be armchair sociologists, because it's a fraud. Sociology is a series of opinions derived from Durkheim, Max Weber, Alfred Weber, Malinowski, Margaret Mead, and they're opinions. Freud, they're opinions. They're not factual scientific observations. They're some of them very insightful opinions, but they have no more value than the opinions of the mystics over the ages. In fact, they have a great deal less value than Lao Tzu and Zheng Tzu and Epictetus and Epicurus and Aristotle, people who did seem to be looking at the world. And they've got this notion that they're going to give us a science. So what Brian Wilson did was he wrote a list of criteria for a religion. And it just so happens that he walked into my bailiwick when he did this, because he decides that Scientology will be the group he assesses to see whether it is or isn't a religion. He decides it is. Having gone through the list in some detail, I'd like to point out the Manson family also was a new religious movement, that the Nazis also are a new religious movement, and that sociology is a new religious movement. If we move back to the word cult until there were changes in the American dictionaries at the end of the 19th century, but the Oxford Dictionary, which requires 400 uses before the meaning of a word is altered. 400 public uses in speeches, in TV, where have you. Up to 1977, the Oxford Dictionary had only that a cult is a devotion to a person or thing. That's it. And that was the first usage of it in that sense was in the year 1711. So what we get is the manipulation of a word, which means a devotion to a person or a thing, that now becomes something negative and bad, and we're not allowed to use it. What Brian Wilson tried to do was to reinvigorate the word sect, which he admitted was a negative word, and replace the word cult with the word sect, and everything got very confusing. Because if you can't describe something, you can't change it. There's nothing you can do about it. I started simply saying authoritarian groups, not even getting into totalitarian. If it's authoritarian, if people are telling me what to do without having to have to justify and explain why they're doing it, there's authority based upon experience. If I want my plumbing done, I get a plumber to do it. Want my wiring done? I get an electrician. That's authority based upon experience. But we have a lot of rank authority, people who, because they have achieved a position, and then you're in a military situation, that can be fine. In a police situation, it can sometimes be necessary, though shooting black people is not at all necessary and is horrific, what's been happening over the decades, particularly in the United States of America, I'm afraid to say, with the mistreatment of black people by the police. But those are authoritarian situations rather than authoritative situations. Yeah. Authoritative means having knowledge, expertise that you can share. So you want surgery, go to a surgeon. But having a society where people are in power because they're in power, so, making cannabis illegal because it happened in Canada in 1924. It was the first of the Western nations to do it because a magistrate had written a novel called The Black Candle under the name Janie Canuck, very inventive, and she'd said that it would lead to the white race becoming impure, that white women, if they smoked cannabis, would want to have sex with black men. That was her opinion. And a law came in to ban this substance with no other evidence than her opinion that there'd be a mixing of races. And you find then, in Britain here, it became serious. It was made illegal in 1928, but it became serious after the Second World War. And one poor guy was sentenced to 8 years in prison for having a single spliff. Mm. You get a situation in the US where 60% of the prison population are in prison for offenses that did not exist in the year 1900. So let's make America great again and go back a little bit. And if somebody's got a drug problem, you go, well, it's a problem, therefore it's a health thing. Let's treat it that way rather than let's, throw them in a pen with a load of rapists and murderers to see if that makes society any better.
Yes.
That is authoritarian. And what we would like to move towards is an authoritative society where we do things, where somebody says, you've got to do this, and you're allowed to say, why? Justify your reasoning for making me do this. And the world might change that a little bit. We want to go and kill 800,000 Iraqis because some Saudi Arabians flew planes into some of our buildings. And it's like, well, Iraq had nothing to do with that. Yeah, but they've got weapons of mass destruction. And on and on and on, No, that didn't make a lot of sense. No, not really. No,
they took out the
executive in an oil company like Halliburton or Condi Rice or Dick Cheney or Don Rumsfeld, and a member of a society which was avowed to remove Saddam Hussein from power, which Cheney and Rumsfeld both were before they got back into power, having been around in the corridors for a long time. That we start seeing things that are hugely irrational, totally antisocial, and destructive of human life because they're based upon personal profit and prejudice. So we stand up against that. And and I will rant no longer at this moment and return the platform to you.
Oh, very, very good. Well, just a quick word about Saddam Hussein. He was not my favorite guy out there, that's for sure. But he was.
Who was your favorite guy in Iraq?
Well, that's a whole nother story. But
the foreign minister who was working for the US government, so they knew that what they were saying was not true.
He was the one leader in that region of the world who is not a religious fanatic. So I honestly think that was not a brilliant move. But not getting back to what we were saying earlier, the definition of the word cult, I find fascinating as well. I remember once speaking with the author Paul Thoreau.
Brilliant.
Briefly. I was sharing with him my first book, and he said, cults. And he pointed out to me that the word cult is in culture.
And cultivate,
right. So I find that I very much, in my own use of the word cult, am referring to that 1700 definition that you were referring to of it is an idea or a person that people are following passionately, or they're devoted to, or there's some passion. It's some, for me, there's some intensity to it. And I personally have no problem with that. So for instance, there's the cult of Gandhi. There's a cult of democracy. It's like, if you're not in a cult, I think there's something wrong with you, because you're sort of, my kids would say, meh, you're sort of like not living. Where I draw the line, and this is, I think we're on similar tracks here with our, maybe I'm not using the exact same terminology, but for me, I think about America is a cult. I mean, this is where the religious fanatics came here, the prisoners went over there. To
any nation is a cult. Anybody who believes in their nation,
of course. But where I draw the line is where a group starts chipping away at people's self-confidence. They take away that self-determination. They form a misinformation bubble, which is, to me, this all not cult-like, but destructive cult-like. And
exactly. And when I first met Steve Hassan in 1989, he came to my house here. Well, not here, actually. It was in another house, actually, if we're going to be absolutely correct. He came to see me and stayed with me. And he was most insistent that if you use the word cult, you must have a prefix to it, which is destructive or dangerous. And I couldn't have agreed more. And I was very interested a couple of years ago, and Steve and I are dear friends, when I had to stop him and say, you need to use the word destructive in front of it.
Just to remind, absolutely. But because the thing is, people come to me and like about cults, and I was like you, I've not professionally, I've never gotten a penny from it, nor do I ever want to get a penny from it. But I've actually helped a bunch of.
You just tried to get $10,000 a month out of me.
I know. I'm sorry, John. There's no fact checking in my country. We're trying to hire some fact checkers in Washington D.C., but they seem to be taking a furlough.
It's all fake news.
It's all fake news.
You haven't got a president.
I run a storytelling gathering, and we've yet to hire a fact-checking department. But the
Tooth Fairy isn't real. The Easter Bunny, Santa Claus. Yes. What are you telling?
Yes, exactly. But I find that I find that it's important to. This is okay. So yes, I have quote. I'm not going to say professionally counseled. Let's just say in plain language. I've talked to a lot of people who needed help. Yeah, I helped them.
I'm the same. I don't use that word counseling. It's
I have a great life. Thank you, Mark. Take care. Bye. And so long. And thanks for all the fish. And people have read my first book. You download it for free on Project Gutenberg, or it's all over the internet. I mean, I was sued $30 million to try to silence me. My reaction, I don't know what Gandhi would have thought about it, because maybe it was a bit aggressive. I don't know how nonviolent it was. I took my first book and put it on the internet for free. So there. So
you didn't do like a salt march or anything like that then?
No, that's a great idea.
Try that.
Hold on, let me get a pen. Let me just write that idea down.
On this invisible
march to the sea. Maybe have a bit of a team. But I guess my point is, I've talked to a lot of people, and in those discussions, and I don't know if this makes me maverick. It sounds like we're on the same page, and certainly Steve and I and a lot of other people. But I don't tell people not to join cults, because first of all, they're going to do it anyway. A, if you tell people not to do it, they'll rush out and do it. B, and C, it's what we're talking about joining a cult is you're experimenting. I'm going to tell young people not to experiment. I don't think so. But let me just finish. Sorry. Where I can, John, what I can do, and this is what I do, is draw the line and say, I can provide you by reading John's book, or reading Steve Hassan's book, or checking out my book, or reading Zimbardo's books, or Lifton, or George Orwell, for that matter. He's not so bad.
Except when he lost the plot at the end of his life, but that's another point, when he was spying on his own friends.
I don't know if you've read his book about his experience volunteering in Spain's Civil War. It's absolutely brilliant.
Homage to Catalonia, yeah.
Yes, it's not just his fiction that is brilliant. I'm sorry, I'm a big proponent of his nonfiction. Anyway, my point is, I am saying to people, go join, go fly. It's what I was saying before. Fly east. Fly west, go explore, people, but be careful. Have a mental map of what could go wrong. This is what happened when John did this. This is what happened when Steve H did this. This is what happened when Mark L did this. So that if it happens to them, they at least have some mental map, something mapped in their emotional world, so that they sort of have a sense of where that exit door may be for them.
Mm. Okay, I take issue with one statement you made there, which is statement number C, about young people experimenting. Because I have 4 children and one grandchild, and I used to be young once. It's hard to believe. But the point is that, say they wanted to experiment by taking strychnine. Would that be permissible? No. So experimentation has to be within bounds. And the hippie dictum was, you experiment, you try these things out. I have tremendous reservations about what some of these experiments have led to. So, for example, if you look at the hippie notion of free love, having sex with anybody. Now, the hippies, 2 things about hippies. Firstly, they were not generally feminist. They were generally chauvinistic, in my experience at the time. The feminism came later. Secondly, there was a lot of homophobia within that. And I don't think that it's a good idea to be sexually promiscuous. It's actually listed as a characteristic of the psychopath by Robert Hare, because people don't have loving attachment. So I think there are a lot of experiments that we can say to our kids, if you do this, this is likely to happen. You'll end up like Mark Laxer, you'll end up like Steve Hassan or John Atack, and you really don't want that. So it's providing some kind of map and understanding with Korzybski that the map is not the territory, word is not the thing itself, and saying these things, that snake, you might want to play with it as an experiment, but it will bite you.
No, I don't disagree with that.
I'm just expanding the statement. I'm sure you don't, but people will experiment. But let's teach what we can about what's dangerous.
Absolutely, that's what I meant by mental map. And I've got a 13, 15-year-old, and they're looking at the world. And
well, I've beaten you. I've got a 16 and 18-year-old.
Oh, you win. Speaking of getting beaten, can I just share something that just happened to me yesterday?
Okay.
My 13, 15-year-olds got together and they beat me in chess. First time
Children
yesterday.
These days.
I am so proud of them. They worked together and they whooped me. Speaking of hierarchy, it was so much fun. Anyway, the thing is, I love people. I love my kids. I love my friends I met in this group turned cult, or whatever you want to characterize it as. I look at the United States, where there's, no matter what happens, there's about 40% of the voting population that is sort of enamored with Mr. Trump. And I think to myself, this is a little challenge I'm having. How do I connect with them? How do I feel?
Yes.
How do I
it's
feel?
No good calling them reptards. It's not going to help.
No. And I don't feel that way. I think
I don't either.
But
I like the word though.
Yeah. Well, the thing is, I've got some very close friends who voted for Trump and are Trump supporters.
Michael Langoni at ICSA voted for Trump.
I know.
Put that in the pipe and smoke it.
Yeah, I know who he is. So I was trying to reach him the other month.
Just tell him you're Donald Trump and see if that gets through. You know.
Yeah, I had a very nice conversation with him. But I find, just in terms of my own challenges, right? It's the same challenge I have now with people who are still in that cult that I was in. The cult leader has since taken his own life, but there's still people who sort of follow him. And I set boundaries about what I'm comfortable with.
Yeah.
It's, you know what it has to do with? It sort of has to do with the other. People who are not like me, who they think very differently. And I've been reading this wonderful book called Rising Out of Hatred by Eli Saslow about white supremacy. And I look at it and I'm like, gosh, these people are like in a cult. And I think about, it's so far from my worldview. It's insane. But then I kind of a little bit do what they're doing. And I say, oh, you're a white supremacist. You voted for Trump.
Therefore, you're evil.
You're evil. And I sort of do a little bit what they do. Is it as bad? I don't know. But I'm aware of it. And I do it in part for self-protection because I get traumatized by somebody coming in and I don't know, let's come up with an extreme example and not talk about my friends because this is not where my friends are.
No, let's talk about your friends. They're not here.
They'd never see a video that you click on public. What if okay, let me talk about a situation that I just finished this book by Eli Saslow. I just mentioned Rising Out of Hatred. It is about a young man named Derek.
Oh, I've heard of him.
Yeah. Whose father who founded Stormfront, this white supremacy nationalist website.
I know about this,
And this young fellow, Derek, his uncle was David Duke, the Klansman, who ran for Senate or Congress or something like that. Governorship, I forget.
He was a grand wazoo of the Klan.
But I forget what David had run for when he ran for office. But in either case, here's young Derek.
Pontiff or something, it's
something like that. But Derek was being groomed by his family to be the heir apparent.
Of the story,
and he started to befriend at this liberal arts college he went to a Jew, a guy from Peru. That kind of rhymes. A Jew, a guy from Peru. I like that. And a few other people who were other. And the people who he was befriending, including his girlfriend, they probably changed the names, but his girlfriend was like at first really repulsed by him, or at least his views. They saw him, including this Jewish Orthodox dude, they saw Derek, as somebody they wanted to reach out to personally, because how do you reach people but through connection? And they did that. Hats off to them, seriously. But they had a kind of, when they read his white supremacist views, they had a kind of repulsion. It was not easy for these people. And in a sense, they're kind of heroic in embracing the other. And I guess my point, I don't know if it's a point or it's a question or it's a comment. I find it in terms of cults and people who are so different from me, including Trump voters. I've seen Trump do so many things to scare me.
Yes.
That remind me of Hitler and Stalin and all sorts of things. It's created such a distance that I think I see some of these Trump voters the way that Derek's friends in college saw Derek.
Yes.
And so it's a lot easier for me to say, I do. I'll see you in a few years when you come back down to earth or whatever. And every single friend, it's traumatic. It's sort of like if you're in a cult and you leave the cult, to talk to people in the cult, it's such a different world. And that's why, in part, I wrote this third book, because it seems to me that the Trump mindset, not necessarily his policies about this and that, his financial policies. That's not why I think he's a cult leader. I may disagree with those policies. I disagreed with George W. Bush's policy. I didn't think he was a destructive cult leader, or not much. Or Reagan. I mean, this to me is not a Democrat versus Republican. Of course, I'm just talking in the U.S. Politics.
Yeah, we have a slightly wider spectrum of politics outside the U.S.
Indeed, you do. And I actually lived over there and across the puddle for off and on for about 11 years. So I know something about it over there. But I just feel that it's so difficult to relate to people who are Trump supporters now. And what I tried to do with this book is to show how Trump is more than a bit like a destructive cult leader. I feel like talking to people who are Trump supporters is a lot like me trying to talk to some people who are still in the Rama group. And they may want to talk to me, they may not. It's the same dynamic. It's fascinating to me.
I think, firstly, hate the sin but love the sinner. Not that I necessarily feel obliged to love anybody. I think that was a mistake that was fed to me in childhood. I will not harm anybody. First, do no harm, the Hippocratic Oath. But there's no obligation for me to love Ted Bundy. And if he came round here, I wouldn't give him a cup of tea. On the other hand, I did a show with my great friend Christian Jurko the other week, and he said to me, we've known each other for 33 years, and he's had 40 years in this business, and I've had 36 off and on. And he said, you're the only person in all these years who said to me they'd be happy to talk to the leader of Scientology and help them if you could. And that just, to me, seems natural. Hate the sin, but love the sinner. Also, the sense of the other, as you say, I'm not on any side. I'm not on this side against that side. When I look at Republicans and Democrats, to me, they're odious. I'm sorry, Barack Obama caused a tremendous amount of harm. If you just look at the great movie with Brad Pitt in called War Machine, Ben Kingsley, if you look at the report, that film, showing that when it's been absolutely proven that there was no advantage to torturing people, and I'm told they were both Mormon bishops, Steve Hassan tells me, who actually, one of them had a PhD in family therapy. I mean, and they claim they were doing waterboarding. They weren't. Waterboarding was a technique actually perfected by the Spanish Inquisition, who nobody expects. And they weren't waterboarding, they were semi-drowning. In waterboarding, you put a wet cloth over somebody's face. They were pouring water into the lungs of people. There was one guy, they did it to 127 times. Not one single scrap, and Obama lied about this and said that they got bin Laden because of this method. They didn't. It was a phone intercept. Nothing good ever came of it. And when the report was made, Obama decided not to publish it so as not to seem partisan. Well, he's a wimp. We have to stand up for principle. He didn't sack anybody from the CIA. So the swamp was not drained, and it hasn't been drained by Trump or QAnon since. The policy in Afghanistan, War Machine, shows that when Stanley McChrystal, who is fictionalized in the film, and brilliantly, I think, by Brad Pitt, it really raised my estimation of him as an actor. And Ben Kingsley, as President Karzai, when Brad Pitt goes to him and says, I've decided what I'm going to do is tour your beautiful country, and I'd like you to come with me. And Kingsley pauses and he says, no, I've already seen it. I'm a totally corrupt person put here by the British and the Americans, and I don't have any interest in the country, really. Thank you very much. That McChrystal spent 70 days trying to get an instruction from Barack Obama, who had just accepted $2 million, I think it is, and the Nobel Peace Prize a week before sending 30,000 troops to McChrystal and saying, sort it out. And he couldn't get instruction. He flies to Paris to try and meet him. Obama's gone. He flies to Copenhagen to meet him. He gets a handshake. So Obama Not happy with him. Not happy with Clinton. I think FDR's sexual, having sex with his niece was, we've got some bad people doing stuff up there. Kennedy, come on, his sexual activities are absolutely despicable. That he and Bobby are sharing Marilyn Monroe, and he's having sex with a colonel in the KGB, which would have come out eventually if, Oliver Stone hadn't found out the truth by going to Fletcher Prouty about what really happened with the mafia. These are bad people, one after another. Some of them are actually mad. Ronald Reagan was suffering from dementia by the end of it. Woodrow Wilson was psychotic by the time he ended the presidency. But because of an authoritarian system, because the president, under all groupthink, is God on earth, rather than a fallible human being. My friend Ira Chaleff long ago launched the idea of courageous followership. That we're responsible for this. It's no good saying, well, he's the boss. We are responsible for this. And we need to have a political shift where we don't have, when John Kerry was standing for president, there's this point where he has a marquee set up, and to go in and talk to him, you had to pay $100,000 into his campaign fund. That's just crooked. It's criminal. But it's, Kissinger, when he complained that he'd never be president because he wasn't born in the country, he also said, and I'd need $23 million to start the campaign. You need $1 billion now. And you get somebody like Mercer funding Cambridge Analytica and also Analog IQ, who were running the campaign for Brexit here. And they just cheat and steal and lie. And we need to change that. These people need to be held responsible. And the first part of that for me is if a politician lies, they're dismissed. If a politician, stands in the Senate, in Congress, in the House, or in our Parliament, and they lie, they should be under oath the same way that a lawyer is under oath whenever they speak in court. They don't have to hold the Bible. The fact they have a certificate of practice means they have to tell the truth, and they're struck off. And I think the same should be true for politicians. When Margaret Thatcher insisted the Belgrano, the Argentinian ship, had been sunk within the exclusion zone, it wasn't. And she knew it wasn't, and she personally gave the order. So I think honesty, transparency, it needs to be there with the cops, with the whole legal system, and you need to double the punishments for people who abuse power. But the punishments are usually a pretty bad idea too, because the word punishment means to inflict pain upon. That's what it means. So we have to restrain Ted Bundy so he doesn't come around trying to beg a cup of tea from me, as I've said, because I'm not going to give him one. Some people do have to be restrained. They're dangerous. I accept that. But for the most part, we need to be responsible, and we aren't being. We absolutely aren't being. People like Hitler, the idea that this mad bugger who was they called him the White Crow, his fellows in the army when he was a corporal. And he's sent in by military intelligence, oxymoron of all time, to spy on the Nazis. He's only the 55th member of the Nazi Party, and he's funded by the German military to do this. And you get this craziness because people are not being responsible. They're not being truthful. They're not going, we should actually look after people. We should make sure that people are okay before we do anything else.
Right.
So,
well, getting back to what we were saying earlier, I think that if we can provide that roadmap for people about boundaries and what you should do, and be careful if you experiment. If you go here, there's probably quicksand there, and this bridge looks a bit creaky to me. Yeah. If we can provide that, and I think it is incumbent upon the educators to provide such information in ways that are palatable and accessible to the young people. So, for example, I can write a long book, and it turns out that young people don't read books anymore. They read tweets, and
we're on YouTube.
Not so much. It's all YouTube and Instagram. I was just lectured by some.
We're on Instagram.
Very, very young people who were telling me, 16-year-olds are saying they absolutely love my book. one of them in Washington, D.C., intends to create a musical that is based on Rama Trauma Trump. I left the cult and now look what happened. And he was explaining to me, the 16-year-old, very bright fellow, that he was explaining that, Mark, we don't use, we 16, 17, 18-year-olds, the 19-year-olds, you're trying to reach young people. He said, we don't speak Facebook. We don't read books. We don't do this, but we sure use Instagram and Snap. And if you can't reach us that way, if we have to click more than twice, you've lost us. Yeah. And so it's TikTok. A bit of, it's difficult. It's a bit of a learning curve for me because I've spent my college experience and then 30 years later trying to hone my craft, putting words, not just John, getting the words there, but getting them in the right order. And now
James Joyce struggled with that, you know?
Indeed he did. Was it a peach or was it a peach? Was that James Joyce?
Perfume of embraces all him assailed. He said, had all the words at the beginning of the day. It took the whole day to put them into order. And it's actually a line, perfume of embraces all him assailed, about women's white bloomers on a washing line.
Yes.
So the word sail is in there.
Yes. And I'm sure Monty Python had some things to say about this as well. Whether
they always did, but they were just
penguin. What is the penguin, by the way, doing on the telly? I've always wondered that. Anyway,
yes, and we're not going to talk. We're not going to use the name of the woman who says it because we can't anymore because it has the N word in it. Mrs. N Beta is the name of the woman who protests about the penguin on the TV. But,
yes,
so and this is deep theology. Suddenly,
this is getting very, 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 very deep. So I think
I think that's something that you've already admitted to, that you're not joining together two dots. 13-year-old, 15-year-old, your house. I have an 18-year-old who is now managing my social media. We moved on to YouTube. I did 4 years of constructing a website which had about 450 articles on it. And I was just at the last minute fitting it all together into a structure. And it didn't happen. And for 2 years, I've been saying, nobody uses websites anymore. The website's where you go for the deep stuff after you've had the 1 minute on Instagram or Snapchat or wherever. And so we went to YouTube last year, my son and I. He was only 17 then. It's amazing. They get older year by year.
Something like that. Do you feed your children? My kids eat quite a bit.
That's where I'm going wrong.
It's to be expensive.
It is, isn't it? It's unnecessary as well. They should be able to feed themselves once they're 3 years old.
A couple of potatoes, that's fine, but let's not go overboard.
Spud gobblers, as my father used to call them. Yeah. But the point is that I'm setting up interviews with teenagers. I know that other than the kind of genial grandfather, this is not my world. My world is to take what has been found out by such luminaries as Philip Zimbardo and translate it into something that Joseph Campbell said that the stories have to be told in every generation and they have to be told in new ways.
Yes.
So I'm going to do Cinderella. You can do Snow White. And these stories, in fact, as Campbell said, when you look into these stories, they are teaching stories, all of them. The way that the Hebrew Bible reformulates the Babylonian myths so that the Garden of Eden, which starts out as a place with the mother goddess, Asherah, in it, who ruled for tens of thousands of years, and the snake is the father god, and he is inviting people. And we have the ring seals that show this story from Babylon more than 1,000 years, 1,500 years before the first possible Hebrew Bible. They're not picking apples. There weren't any apples. They're picking dates. And they're being welcomed into the garden. That's how the story began. But gradually the teaching story comes about saying, tree of knowledge of good and evil. Tree of knowledge is how it's usually referred to. No, knowledge of good and evil. Morality. What's wrong with learning morality? Well, they put fig leaves on themselves, don't they? They say, we're not animals. You're not meant to be a hippie. You're not meant to just have sex with anyone. You're meant to cover up your bits with a nice fig leaf. When you take these stories down, as Campbell said, they're not history, they're psychology, you know, and understanding that the world in that way, we have to tell stories. You're a storyteller. Everything is stories. We learn through stories, and we have to gift the information. What becomes important is making sure that we've got the right information, which is why, again, I'd push Yuval Laor's work, because what Yuval has done is take the emotional aspect of our involvement with things, which nobody in this field has properly studied. We talk about peak experiences from Maslow, and we say, people become emotionally attached. What is all this passion that the Trump supporter, or for that matter, the Clinton supporter, or the Biden supporter, why are we so certain? There's a wonderful book by Robert A. Burton, who was the head of neurology at Mount Zion and University California in San Francisco, called On Being Certain. And he harks back to William James, who 120 years ago said, people develop certainty. I tell the same story every time. When I was 17, I spent 2 hours having a friendly conversation with a born-again Christian, because I'm foolish that way. I talk with people. And I kept asking him questions. And in the end, and I was being nice, I was being friendly, because I am, he backed away from me, that way that people walk backwards away from you because they think you might kill them. And he said, I don't understand the Bible, but I know it's all true. Now, that's the certainty I'm talking about. If we get to, let's go somewhere really dark and unpleasant, a good friend of mine a couple of years ago told me that he believed that the Holocaust didn't happen. And I got into that black-white situation that you were talking about because my father was there at the liberation of Belsen. And he thought it did happen. And the film, A Painful Reminder, made at the time when my father was there, the guy who made it said, I did panning shots to show that we weren't inventing anything. But one of the sequences in that film shows the Germans from the local town being made to bury the corpses of the starved Jews and gypsies who don't usually get mentioned in this conversation. They were wiped out too in their tens of thousands, Roma people. And what is obvious to any human being is that the Germans are still strong enough and well fed enough to bury these corpses, which are quite obviously emaciated to the point of death. So the arguments about, well, the Jews just starved to death because the Allies had cut off the food supply doesn't really work. The Germans cut off the food supply. They decided we won't share with these people because they're Untermensch. They are less than we are. Mm-hmm. So I then spent 3 days, because this guy's a really good friend. I spent 3 days going through my personal Holocaust library. I found Rudolf Höss, his testimony at the Nuremberg trials. He was the first camp commandant at Auschwitz. And when interviewed on the stand, he said, he was asked, so you executed 1.25 million Jews? And he says, executed and exterminated. Then his deputy goes on the stand and says the same thing. They're lying. They didn't actually kill 1.25 million Jews. But it was a lot. They'd lost count by then. They probably killed about 750,000 while he was camp commandant. 750,000 human beings killed. And now we have people who say it didn't happen. You're going, of all the events in history, not one has as many sworn testimonies as the Shoah, the Holocaust. Not one. There are, I think nearly 200,000 sworn testimonies. The Battle of Waterloo, or Gettysburg if you want, there are 10 people writing about it. Yet somebody can come to the point of view where they believe this, and it's because they've developed an inner certainty. So how do you chip away at that certainty? How do you, yes, let's give kids maps, but how do you show people that our certainty is developed not out of evidence, but out of how we feel? As Warren Beatty said, people don't, the great philosopher Warren Beatty, people don't remember what you said, they remember how it made them feel. And Jill Bolt Taylor, who's a a neuroscientist, said, we believe that we are thinking creatures that feel. We are, in fact, feeling creatures that think. And if you then get into the reality, which is that thought and feeling are not separate things, they're not discrete in the human being. So these are things that we can show. Yuval, in the presentation that we have on this very channel, shows how awe, wonder lead to belief without any need to progress through reason. And we then become certain. And he then shows how we take evolutionary natural forms of love and transfer them. So the love of the parent becomes the love of the leader. We should grow out of that. When we mature, the love of the parent should not be, as it is still in Indian society, total obedience to the senior member of the family. We should be allowed to reason. We should be able to say, Dad, you can't play chess. You're no good at it, mate. Try something, do something else with your life. Then you have the love of the sibling. Well, that's your fellow cult members. You know, they're siblings, as all of our friends are our adopted siblings. But you also have the love of the dogma, the love of the doctrine, which is the love that a parent has for a baby. You just said my baby looks like Winston Churchill. I'm not talking to you anymore. So trying to talk to somebody about their dogma and what they believe, you're talking with emotional things. And these are all things. Intelligent Disobedience is another one, which Ira Chaleff, my friend, did a wonderful book called Intelligent Disobedience. You know, he's giving a talk, and you know, he talks to people in high places. Ira does in Congress. He worked for Al Gore for 8 months before he became VP long ago. But so he deals with congressmen all the time. And he's one day giving a talk, and he's talking about this idea he's formulating. And a woman in the audience says, I have an example of that under the desk, which is a kind of a strange thing. And out comes this guide dog. And she said, guide dogs are taught intelligent disobedience. Guide dog with a blind person, if the blind person's just about to walk into something, the dog has to be able to say no. Why don't we teach our children that? Why don't we teach intelligent disobedience to our children? Why don't we let them be assertive and ask questions rather than going, put your hand up if you need to go to the toilet? You know, why aren't we doing this? Why is our culture so fundamentally medieval in its educational system that, I mean, I've been told so many times by teachers that my kids have to jump through hoops so that they can ultimately get an education. And I'm going, I'm happy to give them an education now. I'm also, as a parent, my view is, you know, a teacher thanked me for helping one of my kids with a project. It's like, no, their education is my responsibility. School's there to help me do that. Not
right.
to,
And so, right. So all the things you're saying make sense to me, and
so far
emphasize what we have been discussing, which is when we study cults and find out what's destructive about them, what is compelling, what is dangerous about them, we are holding up a mirror while we're doing that to the larger society
and to ourselves.
And to ourselves, because we're part of that ecosystem, if you will. So
ecosystem.
Ecosystem, indeed. So when we see sort of parallels made from the cult leader, the normal cult leader of a religious sect that turns destructive, and make parallels, as Steve Hassan has done brilliantly, in his Cult of Trump book.
Fantastic.
I think that it's sort of it opens the door for discussion, and I really like that. I think more discussion is needed, and I hope that. So I've got a very close friend who voted for Trump, and I've gone on adventures with him and his kids and my kids, and we all go on adventures together. And we were recently in South America backpacking and stuff like that. And sometimes the discussions get a bit edgy. Lots of friendship, lots of love and all that stuff, but it's like, oh.
How dare you say that?
Well,
not quite that bad.
The thing is, I think a lot of his feelings are that by having someone like Trump in power, it's going to expose and shine a very bright light all around and cause a massive upheaval within society. And this particular friend of mine feels that that is needed. And I'm saying to him, I'm maybe a bit more conservative in this sense. I don't mean politically speaking, but just I say, wait a minute. If you want to have a big upheaval in society, don't you think there's a bit of danger that you're going to blow up the whole effing thing in doing so? Yeah. Couldn't we just dial it back a bit? And he's like, no, bring it on.
Well, I'd recommend Elie Sagan's book, Citizens and Cannibals, about the French Revolution, and suggest that Robespierre might be compared to Trump. And if you want to blow stuff up, it's where Marx was absolutely wrong. The idea that you, first of all, have to have there's no such thing as a bloodless revolution, he said. Of course there is. There's reason. And as John Stuart Mill, again, in On Liberty says, back in, 1859, I think it was, he says, when an idiot talks to you and has told you everything before, your obligation is to listen to them. Your obligation is to hear it again, because you have to accept that you might be wrong. And it's so difficult for us because of our certainties to say that. I say that if we can disagree agreeably, if we can teach our kids that, the things that Matthew Lipman was trying to teach in the 1970s, having given up being a philosophy professor at Columbia, because he said, by the time I get them at age 18, it's too late. They can't think. So he started with Socrates for 6-year-olds. And when you see the incredible achievements through that, the bunch of 15-year-old latchkey kids in the 4th school of last resort, who are all expected to become pimps, drug dealers, and hookers, one class put through this in the 1980s, every kid in that class went on to senior high school instead of, onto the streets, because what they did was put a facilitator in who said, hey, we're going to sit in a circle and everybody's going to give their opinion, going from the left all the way around. And you see the classes, it went on for about 6 months, I think. You see the classes at the start and they're all sort of whatever, meh, sort of. And then by the end, it's this discussion that's going on. People are talking and we have to, we have to get to that place. The thing is that all of the tools exist. Sadly, I'm not a messiah. And what I've done is put together a toolkit from other people's work. I think that's
which we have to do. Highly commendable. And I think, as you were saying before, a lot of it is based on storytelling and reaching the next generation, telling stories in a new way, as you're suggesting, Power of Myth fella Joseph Campbell was saying. And so for me, I'm taking this body of knowledge, or attempting to take a body of knowledge, and craft it into a story that is fun and meaningful, and maybe, and I apologize for this, a bit dark. And I think that's okay.
I don't think there's any need to apologize, because a story has to have an agonist and an antagonist. It has to have redemption. So, I'm by fundamental trade, I'm an artist and novelist. I've written 7 novels. So I very much believe in storytelling as a way of understanding the world and triggering thought in people, getting them to be creative. I wrote a novel called Voodoo Child's Slight Return, which basically takes Jimi Hendrix and maybe brings him back to life. You have to work that out for yourself, but he's now in his 60s, and I spent 2 years studying his life. I think I'm the first person to work out how he actually died, because the threads weren't pulled together. They do exist, and you have to read the book to find out. And it was critiqued by an expert on Hendrix who couldn't fault anything I said. So, I'm very smug about that. I read about the Cherokee, I read about the voodoo, I read about the blues. I put these things together. But what I wrote about is a cult group. And he appears, and somebody has to go into the cult group and see what's going on within the cult group. And it seemed a way of saying, this is the dynamics of a dangerous, destructive group. I mean, you know, I talked at the ICSA conference in Manchester last July, and Eileen Barker, the redoubtable Eileen Barker, Professor Eileen Barker, was in the front row. I don't know what she was doing in the room where I was speaking. I was quite surprised, because she has put forward some, you know, views about new religious movements. And I said, would you agree with me, Eileen, that whether we call it a new religious movement or not, the problem is it a destructive new religious movement?
Exactly.
And she wouldn't speak a word. She wouldn't say anything. Just because she could see I was recording, you know.
That's absolutely fascinating. Well, the power of storytelling is amazing. And the idea of using stories to teach stories is so powerful. And I remember that this is one of the stories I wanted to share with you. I would say this evening here. I'm not sure what time it is. Actually, it's
we will come to a conclusion fairly soon because I haven't eaten.
Yeah.
But
absolutely.
And I hope that we will continue doing this for the rest of our lives.
Very much enjoying this. So I do so much appreciate your time and spending time to interview me. Or maybe I'm interviewing you, or we're interviewing.
Oh, to tell, isn't it?
So, yes, exactly. So, many years ago, I was writing. I had actually finished my first book. I was living in a Volkswagen camper, 74 VW with solar panels on the roof, and
it's going to turn into an Arlo Guthrie song, isn't it?
And they all moved away from me on the Group W mansion.
That's it.
The meanest, nastiest. And
I said, and causing a public nuisance. They all moved back.
They all moved away, and they all came for me, and we had the grooviest time.
Mother rapists, father rapists.
Father rapers and mother sweepers and all kinds of mean, nasty things. And I was living in this Volkswagen camper, and I had a story, John. I had a story called Take Me for a Ride. Coming of age in a destructive cult. And at that same time, I had a $30 million lawsuit chasing me. And I had a few dollars to my name. And I was living in this hippie van with a Siberian husky puppy. And I was
beautiful dogs. Yeah.
Beautiful dogs, yes. And I was trying to think how I've got this story. It's all I had. Oh, actually, I had some friends too, and I had wonderful parents. And but I had this story, and I wanted to share the story, and I didn't know how to share the story. I needed to break out. Will somebody listen to me? And this lawsuit was sort of chasing me. It was a $30 million lawsuit. So this guy obviously believed in reincarnation because it takes many lifetimes to pay back $30 million. And I'm still trying to think, oh my gosh, how am I going to share my story whilst living in a hippie van with a Siberian husky driving back and forth? So what I did is I did something that you and I and other people like Steve Hassan and other educators do. We go on a grassroots level. I had a little sign that I created all by myself. I had a little sign that I printed out on a little plastic thingy that I put on a little wooden table that I had built with my own hammer and nails, which is amazing to have that inside a hippie van. And I went to campuses. And I apologize, I was not doing this in the UK, although maybe that's a good thing because they're doing very well over there. And we're not, but I was.
No, we've got Boris Johnson, we're not.
Okay, no comment.
He's right here.
There's always
Boris Johnson.
I do apologize for that. So so I was trying to share this story. I was going to campuses all across America, starting at University of Vermont, down University of Maryland, and down into Tennessee. And I was going across campuses, and I eventually got to
Alice's restaurant. This is a song about Alice. Sorry.
You remember Alice?
Yeah.
I got to Stanford University. This is a true story. I got to Stanford University. And I was standing there, Mark Laxer, reading War and Peace, and sitting with my Siberian husky and a little bowl of water illegally, John.
Criminal.
Because nobody invited me to Stanford University to be hawking my book. So I had a little sign there. And students would come up to me and they'd say, the sign said,
"You have a permit for that book?"
The sign said, "Meet famous husky and her faithful author." And so people would come up to me, students, we're talking about young people, reaching young people. So young people come up to me and say, and I'm reading War and Peace here, getting educated, right? Educated, reading a little bit of Tolstoy.
Reading a Told Story by Tolstoy.
It was a beautiful story.
Isn't
and
it?
People say, excuse me, sir, why is your husky famous?
Mm.
And I would tell them the story of Alice's. I would tell them the story of how I got in
by
and out
pen
of
photographs.
and in the back of each one, describing what each one was to be used in court of law. And they said, kid, what'd you get? And I said, I got inside a destructive cult and I got myself out of it. And here's a book. And they look at me and they say, and what does the dog have to do with it? And I said, the dog is part of the healing, because I bicycled across America and I thought about my experiences, and I was with the Siberian Husky, and the bicycle trip part is the healing part. And they said to me, they looked at me, John, they said, how much is this book? And I said, how much you got? And I said, if you don't got much, that's not very good English. I apologize for that. If you don't have much, you can get it for free just by going to Project Gutenberg and downloading Take Me for a Ride by Mark Laxer. But if you've got a few dollars, I can go out and buy some cucumbers and maybe an onion and maybe a can of tuna fish tonight to eat. And so that's how I made my living. But the story's not over. I did this at Stanford. I did this all across America. I didn't get arrested once. I did this at Stanford University, and one graduate student came up to me and he said, kid, he said, kid, why is your husky famous? And I told him we had this whole thing back and forth, John, just like I've been telling you. I know I have no fact checker here, but this is what happened. And he said to me, hold it right there, boy. I'm going to go, can I have a copy of this? He gave me $10. I was charging 14. He gave me $10 because I take whatever people gave me. And here's a book. You give me $2. I could get a cucumber and an onion. I like red onions, but you know, we don't have to talk about that.
Let's not be racist about our onions here.
It's a bit snobby. Exactly. I don't want to start crying with onion stories. So he said to me, John, I want to show this to Phil Zimbardo. And the thing is, I didn't flinch because, and I apologize for this, I didn't know who the hell Phil Zimbardo was at that time. Yeah. Because I went to college, I had heard about Phil Zimbardo, the Stanford prison experiments, but I didn't associate his name with it while at Stanford with this graduate student taking a copy of my book saying, stay right there, mister.
Yeah,
keep your dog there too.
Come and talk to you.
You, boy. He came back about an hour later. I'd maybe gone through maybe another 20 pages of War and Peace, as opposed to Warren Buffett. Anyway, the point is that he came back to me and he said, Mark, I said, yeah. He said, Phil wants to talk to you. And I said, who is Phil? And he explained to me who Phil Zimbardo was. And I looked at him and I looked at my Siberian Husky and I looked at the sign. I looked at the students walk by. I said, wow, here I am with this $30 million lawsuit chase. I live in the hippie van. I'm trying to get the word out. And this could be my lucky break.
Yeah.
Because I'm trying to reach people. And guess what? I spoke with Phil Zimbardo. Phil Zimbardo loved my book. He gave me a nice little blurb. And he invited me to address his upper division mind control class at Stanford and give a lecture. And so I got up there and gave a lecture at Stanford University, and I'm supposed to say then I made $1 million or I became successful. Actually, after that, I had a great life.
I ascended to heaven.
Just a regular guy. Happy to share my story. That first book is up on the internet for free, as I mentioned earlier. I'm thrilled. A lot of people have been helped by it. Just like a lot of people, you may not be rich from this, John.
Not yet.
But a lot of people, not yet, a lot of people have been helped by your work. Hopefully. And that's really special. You know, all joking aside, that's really special. And if somebody, even if it's one person, has more of a sense of self-direction and self-confidence, not that it came from you or it came from me, but they got out of a jam, I guess, but I used a little bit too much force. But if someone gets out of the rut,
I hope the people notice the quick Bob Dylan reference, though.
Yeah, thank
Tangled
you.
up in blue.
So yes, so I really feel that, and that moment with Phil Zimbardo at Stanford was like a little pat on the back.
Yeah.
But I don't need credentials. I don't need money. I don't need structure or hierarchy. I could just send out my book for free, and if a few people read it, or let's say Anderson Cooper, or somebody, Roger Waters likes it and he sends out a tweet or something like that, or David Gilmour. Imagine both of them.
Yeah, well, it'd be difficult for them to agree on anything after all.
Well, my point. Imagine if they agreed that they both like, or both they totally agree that they both really disdain
Rick Wright's gone, so.
Yes.
So they're both so great gig in the sky.
I'm sorry. I'm sorry for this digression, but it's never been David or Roger. They're both so insanely talented.
Oh, absolutely.
So intensely talented.
Unbelievable.
Anyway, that's my little story about Phil Zimbardo. It was a special moment in my life in that here was my brush with hierarchy. Here's Phil Zimbardo up at Stanford. And what a wonderful human being. He's a humanist. Stanford, the people there were lovely. He
cancelled my talk, though. I was actually there. What year were you there? You got any vague idea?
It was a while ago, sometime in the
80s.
Actually, it was my lawsuit was. Let's see, I think in the early 90s.
Oh, I was there in 88, and I'd been booked to give a talk, and they cancelled on me. So. But we did manage to tempt him into being on the board of the advisory board of the Open Minds Fund.
I don't mean to be so bold, but I think I know why. Did you have a Siberian Husky puppy with you?
It's always a mistake not to.
Oh, John.
But getting them through quarantine these days, you have to put them in. The first time I came to the US in '86, the guy said to me as I come in, "Did I have any fruit?" And I went, "You're a lunatic. Of course I don't have any fruit." And I got just past him and I realized I got 2 bananas in my bag. You can imagine.
Just glad to see me.
Yeah, that's it. Is that a canoe in your trousers, or are you just glad to see me, as Rick Mail put it? This has been fantastic.
I've really enjoyed this. I do so much appreciate this. And
me too. You're as foolish as I am. What can I say?
One quick retort to that, if I may.
Yes, one quick retort. Is this a retort as in a chemistry lab?
No. I grew up on Monty Python. That's what shaped my personality.
Oh, I had milk and biscuits. Stanley Milliken. So if I'm a bit silly, it's their fault. And yes.
Bloody hell.
Yeah, well, I grew up on the Goons, which is what Monty Python grew up on. So it's endemic. It's falling underwater.
You win.
Thank you. Okay, lovely talking with you, Mark. Hi, John here. Thanks for watching. We'd appreciate it very much if you would click like, as well as subscribe, and click the bell for notifications. Every dollar helps, and we welcome new patrons on Patreon, or you can make a one-off payment with any currency through PayPal. Thanks so much.